All right. Hello, welcome back. We'll be reading a little bit more of Journey to the Center of the Earth. Um, as we had just left off, we had read the first 20 chapters, in which Axel, a young geologist, and Otto, his uncle, also a geologist, had traveled to Iceland in hopes of finding a certain geological discovery at the heart of a mountain, where they thought they might be able to travel to the center of the Earth. They had enlisted the help of a Icelandic guide, uh, and they had just gone down a particular crossroads, which they had hoped might lead them to where they were looking for, but led them only to a empty coal mine. So they've just started back, beginning chapter 21. Compassion melts the professor's heart. Next day, we started off early. We had to hurry. It was a 3-day walk back to the crossroads. I will say nothing of the sufferings we endured during our return. My uncle bore with them, with the angry impatience of a man obliged to admit his own weakness. Hans, with the resignation of his passive nature, I must confess, with complaints and expressions of despair. We didn't have the mental strength to cope with this ill fortune. As I had warned, the water ran out by the end of the first day's march back. All we now had as liquid food was gin, but the infernal fluid burned my throat, and I couldn't even bear the sight of it. I found the temperature and the air stifling. Fatigue paralyzed my limbs. More than once I almost collapsed. Then there would be a stop, and my uncle and the Icelander would do their best to restore me. But I could see that the former was struggling with difficulty against extreme fatigue and the tortures of thirst. Finally, on Tuesday, July 8th, we arrived, half dead and on our hands and knees, at the junction of the two passages. I lay there like a lifeless mass, stretched out on the lava. It was 10 in the morning. Hans and my uncle, leaning on the wall, tried to nibble a few bits of biscuit. Long moans escaped from my swollen lips. After some time, my uncle came over to me and raised me in his arms. "My poor boy," he said, in genuine tones of compassion. I was touched by these words, not being accustomed to see the excitable professor in a gentler mood. I grasped his trembling hands in mine. He let me hold them and looked at me. His eyes were moist. Then I saw him take the flask that was hanging at his side. To my amazement, he placed it to my lips. "Drink this," he said. Had I heard him correctly? Was my uncle mad? I stared at him in a daze, unable to grasp what he was saying. "Drink it," he said again. And raising his flask, he emptied it, every drop between my lips. Oh, infinite bliss! A mouthful of water came to moisten my burning mouth. It was just one sip, but it was enough to bring back my ebbing life. I thanked my uncle with clasped hands. "Yes," he said, "a mouthful of water, but it's the last one, do you hear me? The very last. I've been keeping it as a precious treasure at the bottom of my flask. 20 times, no, 100 times, I fought off a terrible impulse to drink it. But no, Axel, I kept it for you." "My dear uncle," I said, whilst hot tears trickled down my face. "Yes, my poor boy. I knew that as soon as you arrived at these crossroads you would collapse half dead, and I kept my last drop of water to refresh you." Thank you," I said. Although my thirst was only partially quenched, some strength had nevertheless returned. The muscles of my throat, tightened until then, now relaxed again. My lips became a little less inflamed, and I was able to speak again. "Well, now," I said, "there's only one thing we can do now. We have no water. We must go back." While I was saying this, my uncle was avoiding looking at me. He hung his head. His eyes avoided mine. "We have to go back!" I exclaimed vehemently. "We have to go back to Snæfell. May God give us the strength to climb up the crater again." "Go back," said my uncle, as if he was talking to himself rather than me. "Yes, go back, and there's not a minute to lose." A long silence followed. "So then, Axel," replied the professor in a strange voice, "you found no courage or energy in these last few drops of water?" "Courage?" I see you are just as weak-willed as you were before, and still expressing nothing but despair. What sort of a man was I dealing with here? And what schemes did he now have going round in his fearless mind? What? You won't go back? Should I give up this expedition, just when we have the best chance of success? Never. Then we must resign ourselves to perishing? No, Axel, no. You go back. Hans will go with you. Leave me here myself. Leave you here? Leave me, I tell you. I have undertaken this expedition. I'll carry that to the end, and I will not go back. Go on, Axel, just go. My uncle was in a state of feverish excitement. His voice, which had for a moment been tender and gentle, had now become harsh and threatening. He was struggling with gloomy determination to do the impossible. I didn't want to leave him in this bottomless abyss, but on the other hand, the instinct for self-preservation was prompting me to flee. The guide watched this scene with his usual phlegmatic unconcern. Nevertheless, he understood perfectly well what was going on between his two companions. Our gestures themselves were sufficient to show that we were each bent on taking a different path. But Hans seemed to have no interest in a matter on which his life depended. He was ready either to start out at a given signal, or to stay, if his master so willed it. How I wished at this moment I could have made him understand me. My words, my complaints, my tone would have had some influence over his impassive nature. Those dangers which our guide could not understand, I could have demonstrated and proved to him. Together we might have overruled the obstinate professor. If necessary, we might perhaps have been able to force him back up the heights of Snæfell. I approached Hans, put my hand on his. He didn't move. My parted lips sufficiently revealed my sufferings. The Icelander slowly shook his head, and pointing calmly at my uncle, said, Master. Master? I shouted. Are you crazy? No, he isn't master over your life. We must get out of here. We must drag him with us. Do you hear me? Do you understand? I'd seized Hans by the arm. I wanted to get him to stand up. I struggled with him. My uncle intervened. Be calm, Axel. You'll get nothing from that stoical servant, so listen to what I have to suggest. I folded my arms and faced my uncle boldly. The lack of water, he said, is the only obstacle in our way. In this eastern gallery, made up of lavas, schists, and coal, we haven't come across a single drop of moisture. Perhaps we'll have better luck if we follow the western tunnel. I shook my head incredulously. Hear me out, the professor went on with a firm voice. While you were lying there motionless, I went to examine the conformation of that gallery. It goes straight down, and in a few hours it'll bring us to granite rocks. There we are bound to meet with plentiful springs of water. The nature of the rock assures me of this, and instinct agrees with logic to support my conviction. Now, this is what I suggest. When Columbus asked his ship's crews to allow him 3 more days to discover a new world, those crews, disheartened, and sick as they were, recognized the rightness of the request, and he discovered America. I am the Columbus of this nether world, and I ask for only 1 more day. If in a single day I have not found the water we need, I swear to you, we will return to the surface of the earth. In spite of my irritation, I was moved by these words, as well as by the violence my uncle was doing to his own desires in making so dangerous a proposal. Well, I said, do as you will, and may God reward your superhuman energy. You have now but a few hours to tempt fate. Let's make a start. Up next is Chapter 22, A Total Lack of Water. This time we started our descent in the new gallery. Hans led the way, as was his custom. We hadn't gone 100 yards when the professor, moving his lantern along the walls, exclaimed, Here are some primitive rocks. Now we're on the right path. Forward! When in its early stages the earth was slowly cooling, its contraction gave rise to disruptions, distortions, fissures, and chasms in its crust. The passage through which we were walking was one such fissure, through which, at one time, granite had poured out in a molten state. Its 1,000 meanders formed an intricate labyrinth through the primeval mass. As fast as we descended, the succession of strata forming the primitive foundations appeared with increasing distinctness. Geologists consider this primitive matter to be the base of the mineral crust of the earth, and have ascertained it to be composed of 3 different formations: schist, gneiss, and mica schist, resting on that unchangeable foundation, granite. Never had mineralogists found themselves in such wonderful circumstances to study nature in situ. What the drilling machine, an ignorant and brutal contraption, was unable to bring up from the inner structures to the surface of the globe, we were able to see with our own eyes, and handle with our own hands. Through the beds of schist, colored with delicate shades of green, ran winding threads of copper and manganese, with traces of platinum and gold. I thought to myself, what riches are buried here at an inaccessible depth, hidden forever from the covetous eyes of the human race. These treasures have been buried at such an extreme depth by the convulsions of primeval times that they run no risk of ever being harmed by pickaxe or spade. After the schists came gneiss, partially stratified, remarkable for the parallelism and regularity of its lamina. Then mica schists, lying in large plates or flakes, revealing their structure by the sparkle of the white, shining mica. The light from our Ruhmkorff lamps, reflected from the small facets of quartz, flashed sparkling rays in every direction, and I felt as if I was moving through a diamond, within which the darting rays crisscrossed in 1,000 flashing coruscations. About 6 o'clock this brilliant feast of light underwent a noticeable reduction in its splendor, and then almost ceased entirely. The walls took on a crystalline but sombre appearance. The mica was more intimately mixed with the feldspar and quartz to form the rock of all rocks, the hard stone that forms the foundations of the earth, and which, without being crushed, bears the weight of the 4 terrestrial rock systems. We were walled up within prison walls of granite. It was 8 in the evening. There had been no sign yet of water. I was suffering terribly. My uncle marched on. He refused to stop. He was listening anxiously for the murmur of distant springs. But no, there was absolute silence. And now my legs were refusing to carry me any further. I fought the pain and torment in order not to stop my uncle, which would have driven him to despair, because the day was drawing to its close, and it would be his last. Finally, my strength gave out. I gave a cry and fell to the ground. Help, I'm dying. My uncle retraced his steps. He looked at me with his arms folded. Then these muttered words passed his lips. It's all over. The last thing I saw was a terrifying gesture of rage, and my eyes closed. When I reopened them, I saw my 2 companions motionless and rolled up in their coverings. Were they asleep? For my part, I couldn't get a wink of sleep. I was suffering too much, and what made my thoughts especially bitter was that there was no remedy for my condition. My uncle's last words echoed painfully in my ears. It's all over. For in such a terrible state of weakness, it was madness to even think of ever reaching the upper world again. Above us there was a league and a half of terrestrial crust. The weight of it seemed to be pressing down on my shoulders. I felt weighed down, and I exhausted myself with violent struggles to turn over on my granite bed. A few hours passed. A deep silence reigned around us, the silence of the grave. No sound could reach us through walls, the thinnest of which were 5 miles thick. But even in my stupor, I thought I could hear a noise. It was dark down the tunnel, but I thought I could see the Icelander, vanishing from sight with the lamp in his hand. Why was he leaving us? Was Hans going to abandon us? My uncle was fast asleep. I wanted to shout, but my voice died on my parched and swollen lips. The darkness became deeper, and the last sound died away in the far distance. Hans has abandoned us, I shouted. Hans! Hans! These words were only spoken within me. They went no further. Yet, after the first moment of terror, I felt ashamed of suspecting a man of such extraordinary faithfulness. Instead of going up, he was going down the gallery. Any evil intention would have taken him up, not down. This thought made me calm again, and I turned to other thoughts. Only some important purpose could have induced this quiet man to give us sleep. Was he off on a search? Had he, in the silence of the night, detected a sound, a murmur of something in the distance, which I had failed to register? Which leads us into chapter 23. Water discovered. For a whole hour, I was trying to work out in my delirious brain the reasons which might have made this calm huntsman behave like this. The most absurd notions ran in utter confusion through my mind. I thought I was going mad. But at last the noise of footsteps could be heard in the dark abyss. Hans was coming back. A flickering light was beginning to glimmer on the wall of our dark prison. Then it appeared at the mouth of the gallery, and then Hans appeared. He went over to my uncle, put his hand on his shoulder, and gently woke him. The uncle got up.
What's the matter?
He asked. Latin, replied the huntsman. Under the inspection of intense pain, no doubt everybody becomes endowed with the gift of tongues. I didn't know a word of Danish, yet instinctively I understood the word he had uttered. Water! Water! I shouted, clapping my hands and waving my arms like a madman.
Water?
Repeated my uncle.
Var?
He asked in Icelandic.
Nay that,
Replied Hans. Where? Down below. I understood everything that was being said. I grasped the hunter's hands and held them tightly while he looked at me calmly. The preparations for our departure were not long in making, and we were soon on our way down a passage that inclined 2 feet in 7. In an hour we had gone 1.25 miles and descended 2,000 feet. Then I began to hear distinctly a new sound of something running within the thickness of the granite wall, a kind of dull, dead rumbling, like distant thunder. During the first part of our march, not coming on the promised spring, I could feel my distress returning. But then my uncle acquainted with the cause of the strange noise.
Hans wasn't mistaken, he said. What you hear is the rushing of a torrent.
A torrent? I exclaimed.
No doubt about it. There's a subterranean river flowing around us.
We hurried on in the greatest excitement. I was no longer aware of my fatigue. This murmuring of waters, close at hand, was already refreshing me. It was getting increasingly loud. The torrent, after having flowed for some time above our heads, was now flowing, roaring, and rushing within the left wall. Frequently I touched the wall, hoping to feel some indication of moisture, but I couldn't feel anything. Another half-hour passed, and we'd covered another half-league. Then it became clear that the hunter hadn't managed to go any farther than this point. Guided by an instinct particular to mountaineers and water diviners, he had, as it were, felt this torrent through the rock, but he had certainly seen none of the precious liquid, nor had he slaked his thirst. Soon it became clear that if we continued walking, we would increase the distance between ourselves and the stream, the noise of which was becoming fainter. We went back. Hans stopped where the torrent seemed closest. I sat near the wall, while the waters were flowing past me violently, only 2 feet away. But there was a thick granite wall between us and the object of our desires. Without thinking, without wondering if there were any means of getting the water, I gave way to a feeling of despair. Hans glanced at me, I thought, with a smile of pity. He looked up and picked up his lamp. I followed him. He moved toward the wall, while I looked on. He put his ear against the dry stone, and moved it slowly backwards and forwards, up and down, listening intently. I realized at once that he was searching to find the exact spot where the torrent could be heard the loudest. I found that spot on the left-hand side of the tunnel, 3 feet from the ground. I was almost overcome with excitement. I hardly dared guess what the hunter was about to do. But I couldn't help but understand, and applaud and cheer him on, when I saw him take hold of the pickaxe to attack the rock. "We're saved!" I cried.
Yes, cried my uncle, almost frantic with excitement. Hans is right. What an excellent fellow. Who but he would have thought of it?
Yes, who but he? Such an expedient, simple as it was, would never have crossed our minds. True, it seemed extremely hazardous to strike this part of the earth's structure with a hammer. What if some rocks moved and crushed us all? What if the torrent, bursting through, drowned us in a sudden flood? There was nothing foolish in these fantasies. But nonetheless, no fear of falling rocks or rushing floods could stop us now, and our thirst was so intense that, to satisfy it, we would have dug down into the ocean bed itself. Hans set about the task which my uncle and I together could not have accomplished. If impatience had given our hands the power, we would have shattered the rocks into 1,000 fragments. Not so Hans. Completely under control, he calmly cut his way through the rock with a steady succession of light, skillful strokes, creating an opening 6 inches wide. I could hear noise of flowing waters getting louder, and I fancied I could feel the delicious fluid refreshing my parched lips. The pickaxe had soon penetrated 2 feet into the granite partition, and our man had been working for over an hour. I was in an agony of impatience. My uncle wanted to take stronger measures, and I had some difficulty in dissuading him. However, he had just picked up a pickaxe when a sudden hissing was heard, and a strong jet of water spurted out, hitting the opposite wall. Hans, almost thrown off his feet by the force of the shock, uttered a cry of pain, and I soon understood why, when, plunging my hands into the gushing torrent, I hastily pulled them out again. The water was scalding hot. "The water's boiling!" I cried. "Well, never mind, let it cool," my uncle replied. The tunnel was filling away with steam, whilst a stream was forming, which slowly trickled away into the winding subterranean passages. Soon we had the satisfaction of swallowing our first mouthfuls. Could anything be more delicious than the feeling that our intolerable burning thirst was easing, leaving us to enjoy comfort and pleasure? But where was this water from? It didn't matter. It was water, and though still hot, it brought life back to the dying. I drank without stopping, almost without even tasting it. It was only after a moment of savoring the water that I exclaimed, "Why, this spring has iron salts in it." "Nothing could be better for the digestion," said my uncle. "It's full of iron. It'll be as good for us as going to the spa or Toplitz." "Well, it's delicious." "Of course it is. Water should be when it's found 6 miles underground. It has an inky flavor, which is not at all unpleasant. What an excellent source of strength Hans has found for us here. We'll name it after him." "That's a good idea," I said, and Hans's brook it was from that moment on. Hans was none the prouder for this honor. After drinking moderately, he quietly went over to a corner to rest. "Now," I said, "we mustn't lose this water." "Why trouble ourselves about that?" replied my uncle. "I don't imagine it'll ever run out." "Yes, but we can't be sure it won't. Let's fill the water bottle and our flasks, and then block up the opening." My advice was followed as far as getting a supply of water was concerned, but blocking the hole was not so easy to accomplish. In vain we picked up pieces of granite and stuffed them in with tow. We only scalded our hands without succeeding in blocking the flow. The pressure was too great, and our efforts were fruitless. "It's obvious," I said, "that the main body of this water is at a considerable height above us. The force of the jet shows that." "No doubt," answered my uncle. "If this column of water is 32,000 feet high, that is, coming from the surface of the earth, it is equal to the weight of 1,000 atmospheres. But I've got an idea." "Well?" "Why bother to stop the stream coming out at all?" "Because, well, I couldn't actually think of any reason." "When our flasks are empty, where will we be able to fill them again? Can we know that for sure?" "No, we couldn't be sure about that." "Well, let's keep this water running. It'll flow downwards and will both guide us and refresh us." "That's a good plan," I said. "With this stream for our guide, there is no reason why we shouldn't succeed in our undertaking." "Ah, my boy, so you agree with me now?" exclaimed the professor, laughing. "I heartily agree with you." "Well, let's rest a while, and then we'll start off again." I was forgetting that it was night time. The chronometer soon informed me of that fact, and in a very short time, refreshed and thankful, we all three fell into a sound sleep. And, well, I've got a little bit more time, but this next chapter might be a little bit too long, so we'll cut it off there. Next time we'll have to read chapter 24. Well said, Olmol. Canst thou work at the ground so fast? Um, Thank you very much for joining me today, and we're working right through this book. Um, and hopefully I'll see you next week. Bye.